How we doing on sound? Sounds like we have sound. By the way, I was a tank company in Germany and then a brigade headquarters company. My little brother was a Green Beret as well, so anyway. By the way, if you guys have questions while I'm up here, please go ahead and ask, because if you're like me, if you have to wait until the end, I'll forget it, you know, so we'll dive right into this. John Slemp's my name. So this started in 2014, and essentially, I had known about the jackets for a long time, but I had never seen one. And I belonged to the Experimental Aircraft Association chapter in Lawrenceville, and I asked around, and I said, if anybody has one, I'd like to see it and possibly photograph it. So somebody brought one in, and it was spectacular. And I photographed it, and to make a long story short, I sent a curator at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, whom I had met through one of my clients, a couple of the pictures. 58 minutes later, I get a separate email saying, we have 15 jackets that'll work for your project. When can you be here? I was shocked. And that's how it started. Initially, I had no concept of creating a book or anything like that. Initially, I just wanted to create images that I thought might be worthy of a discussion online about lighting techniques, that sort of thing, maybe an exhibition. But it has taken on a whole life of its own, which I'm actually quite enthused about, to be honest with you. These are the museums. I got to photograph in 12 different museums when it was all over with across the country. The Naval Aviation Museum is honored. They had one A2 jacket, and let's see. The last museum I photographed was in the United States Air Force Museum. I tried to shoot there in 2015, and they essentially wanted a letter from a publisher, which I didn't have. So in 2021, a friend of mine was there. He ran into the director of the museum. He got his card, and he gave it to me. And he said, talk to him again. And essentially in those 5-6 years, their attitude towards self-publishing had changed. I contacted their PR office in New York, sent them some pictures of what we had done to date, and a month later they said, come on down. So I got to shoot there in January of last year, which was quite a treat, to be honest with you. And before we get too far along, and I failed to say so, I wanted to say thanks very much to the people in this room that contributed materially to the book. Terry Kingry's dad's jacket is in the book. Mark Thomason's dad's in the book. Punchy Powell, of course, he's in the book. And you know, it meant a lot to me that these folks were more than willing to participate. This was the first jacket that was photographed in the effort. And those are 50 bombs on the front. Those are not fish, as someone was confused. And I clarified that for him. But, come to find out that if you were in the 15th Air Force in Italy, and initially if you flew over 600 miles one way, you got credit for 2 missions, even though it was one target. And that was the case up until October 44, and they changed it to 1 mission, 1 target, 1 mission. Of course, being the Army, some guys were not happy about that. But that's why a lot of the 15th Air Force jackets have 50 bombs on the front, even though it was technically 35 missions. Sergeant Clement participated in the Ploesti oil field raids and survived, and he retired in Charleston, South Carolina, where he passed away in the 80s. But this was the first jacket, and when I saw the grime in the collar, that's what really got me. This is a real guy, somebody who sweated in this jacket and personalized it, so to speak. And as you can see, maybe a little bit here, the AN right here, that stands for Army Navy. That was an inspector's stamp. Not all of them have it, but they did have inspectors that went around to the various facilities where these were put together and got the stamp of approval, so to speak. And this is the back of the same jacket. And, I thought there might be more of this, scantily clad females on jackets and so on, but actually it's only 2 or 3 where that's been the case. There were probably more out there, I'm sure there are, but of the 162 that I photographed, there was only 3. And, there's several reasons for that. Probably the most important reason is that when you got back from the war, to Littleville, USA, you didn't wear something like this on Main Street, So they went into closets and under beds and attics and so on, and thus they survive. And for some non-aviation people, they have a hard time deciphering missing you. So again, we have to clarify that. But as you can tell, there was even then a fine appreciation by these guys for the female form. This guy was a member of the 100th Bomb Group. This jacket was brought to me from Griffin, just south of town. And this is the second jacket that this fella owned. His original jacket he wore out. This jacket belonged to a friend of his who was killed in action. And it was not that uncommon for jackets to float, shall we say. Sometimes if you went into a club and hung it up, you might go back and find it's not there. One fellow that I photographed, he was wounded, and his jacket was liberated while he was in the hospital. And I heard firsthand from an 8th Air Force veteran down at the Atlanta History Center several years ago. He said oftentimes when a crew did not come back from a mission, the first thing that happened was the guys in the same hut or Nissen hut, whatever, they would go into the Foot Locker and find whatever that either A, shouldn't be sent back to the States to the families because it might incriminate a guy, or B, if there was something he could wear, the jacket and so on, then they would pull that out. Sometimes guys showed up later on, they were still alive and wanted their stuff back. And that's a whole nother story, but anyway, this is a lovely jacket here, another 15th Air Force guy. And one of the distinguishing characteristics, especially in the 15th, was the patches. And I have a close-up here, I think the next one. Yeah, here it is. So you see this patch here on the sleeve. The Italians, their economy was wrecked. So they had artisans making patches, painting, whatever. And so you could get a custom-made leather patch for your jacket. And for, I don't know, whatever, a few lira or whatever their currency was. And I believe the island of Corsica was a big spot for that because it was also an R&R rest and recreation spot for the guys. And the other thing you'll notice here too is that the captain bars are embroidered on the jacket. Most often they didn't wear the metal insignia. There was 2 reasons for that. One, it could be a puncture hazard in case of a crash. And secondly, it could get hung up in your parachute harness. So most often they were either painted on or embroidered onto the jacket. And this is the back of the same jacket. And I have a picture of the owner holding up this jacket with another fellow in World War II. And that is that, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but that helps establish provenance. If you know, you're collecting the jackets and you want to know if it's authentic or not, you ask for documents. You know, let me see some documents from the guy, which unit he was in, how many bomb missions. They actually kept pretty detailed records of the number of missions and targets, that sort of thing. Photographs of him wearing the jacket, etc. And so this is the same jacket. I unzipped the liner, or undid the zipper so you could see the liner. This liner has been replaced. And it was thought that at the time the Army wouldn't want it back if it had been personalized, so to speak. So the Army being what it is, they always want their stuff back. So, you know, you could either pay for it or just say I lost it, whatever the case may be. And sometimes when these things were replaced, the tag was put back in up at the top here, and sometimes they weren't. I was swapping emails with a fellow in England while I was in the middle of the project, and he said, "Oh, you got to shoot the tags." He asked me if I was photographing the tags. I'm like, "Not necessarily." And he said, "Oh, you got to photograph the tags because people want to know who the manufacturer was and all that information." I'm like, "Okay." So I started paying more attention to it at that point. And there's actually a PDF on the website that you can download that has all that information. So that's a nickel there, and as you can see, it's 21 millimeters. Why is that significant? What's it close to, measurement-wise? 20 millimeters, right? And 20 millimeters is what the German aircraft had. You know, that's what they were firing at these bombers. And the thickness of the skin on these aircraft was about the same as a business card. There's not a lot of protection. So this is actual diary entry here. Again, just a small handheld notebook. I'll read it here to you. Group hit Blechhammer North today. I flew with Van's crew. Had number 2 engine shot out over the target. The ball turret was out, left waist and left tail guns out, attacked by Me-109's German fighters as we were straggling. We got back somehow. Hydraulic system shot out, no brakes, ran off the runway between 2 parked ships, jumped 3 or 4 ditches and came to rest 300 yards off the runway in a wheat field. No one hurt, ship full of holes. And in another entry, he says this was the second time it happened. And I said, that's enough. So, you know, this illustrated to me you could go out on a mission, complete the mission, and come back and you could be killed on landing. But this was very hazardous, extremely hazardous duty. And that happened more often than you might think. You know, and my hat is off to these guys in a lot of ways. So this is, Mark is very close to this story here. This is Mark's dad down here on the lower left, Walter Thomason, correct? Mark was kind enough to give me this picture here for the book. I photographed his jacket in 2015, if I recall, right before I went to Oshkosh in July, and I put the picture on my iPad. While I was up at Oshkosh, I was working on a job, and I was talking to a fellow that I had to coordinate with, and I told him what I was doing. And he said, "Oh, my dad was a bomber crewman," and he said the pilot's name was Walter Thomason. I was shocked. I didn't say a word. I took out my iPad, went to the picture, I said, "This Walter Thomason?" And we had goosebumps for 5 minutes talking about it. And nowhere else in the world would that have happened. He brought his dad's jacket to Oshkosh the following year, and I photographed it. That's it on the right. That's Mark's dad's jacket on the left. So we have 2 jackets from the same crew in the book. Even though they're slightly different colored, there's no doubt in my mind that it's the same artist. You know, again, just little things happen like that to me. And I found this online. This is actually, I think, your dad's jacket, Mark.
I think it is.
And for some reason, the Army documented some of these jackets. I don't know why. I haven't been able to find that out. But you can find these in the national, see the A65462AC. If you enter that number into the National Archives, you can probably get a higher resolution picture of this for free. Mark brought this to me the first time I photographed his dad's jacket, but he wouldn't leave it with me. We didn't know each other that well then, in his defense. But it's a .45 caliber ammunition box with these bomb tags in it. And you know how you've seen pictures of the bombs coming out in this staggered form beneath the aircraft? Well, immediately, this is 34 bomb tags, and this is essentially his dad's diary. And immediately I got that pattern in my head. And so I got the tags back a year later, and this is actually 3 photographs put together, but I had an exhibition and we made one long vertical panorama. It's about 6 feet tall, 18 inches wide, and it's got all the tags in it. Here's a close-up. So this is mission number 31 on the top right, September 22nd, 44, Kassel, Germany. 6 500-pound general purpose bombs and 6 500, I think, incendiary. IB is my guess. Osnabrück, Cologne, and Magdeburg. And you can see, so in 6 days he flew 4 missions. It was not uncommon for these guys to complete 25, 30, 35 missions in a matter of months. So they could finish sometimes in as little as 2 months, 3 months, etc. So there was a constant turnover of personnel, and I'm sure it was a tremendous headache, maybe not headache, challenge is probably a better word, for the commanders. You know, and just the whole system to keep it supplied. And that's one of the reasons. So initially, there were no quotas at the beginning of the war, as far as how many missions you had to fly. And of course, guys started showing up to the flight surgeon, a medical doctor. Each group had a flight surgeon. You know, I've got a stubbed toe, I got an earache today, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I don't feel like going to get shot at. And these guys realized that there was a morale problem. And so they made a recommendation to the commanders, we need to put a quota on this. So initially it was set at 25, and then it became 30 and 35 by the end of the war. But even so, at 35 missions, you could literally fly those, if it was good weather, in 2 months or a little more. So it was a tremendous challenge to keep experienced crews on hand to go and complete the missions. Several of the medals here, Distinguished Flying Cross and Air Medal on the top there. And the pieces here, right here, those are actual pieces of flak from German 88. They're very sharp, very dense, and I can see why it was a bad day if you got hit by one. But it was not uncommon for these pieces of flak to come into the aircraft and sort of bounce around and then come to rest on the floor. You know, and so the guys would pick them up, you know, souvenir when they got back, if they got back. You know, and just one of the things that happens. This is Jimmy Stewart's jacket, photographed at the Air Force Museum in Dayton last year. The collections manager told me that my request to come and shoot jackets there actually did them a favor. And I was kind of curious. I said, how so? And she said it prompted us to get our hands on the jackets. Some were still in storage, and some had been in display cases for decades, actually. And she said this was only the second time since 1968 that Jimmy's jacket had been out of the display case. So, which means nobody else has this picture. So I was thrilled about that, to be honest with you. And, you know, and it was just very cool to be that close to history, if you will. And I felt that way about all these jackets, to be honest with you. So this is another jacket. The daughter lives in Decatur, and her dad was in California. She actually went out there on a visit and brought this jacket back to me. And I included in here for 2 reasons. One is the color. So there were 18 different manufacturers across the country. And at the time, the government procured all the materials, the leather, the lining, the woolen cuffs and waistband, the zippers, the snaps, everything that pertained to the jacket, and they gave it to the manufacturers. Here's a diagram, build us a jacket. And they would do that for about $8 and a quarter. You know, so it, but there were 18 different manufacturers across the country. Yes?
Just a quick question. Were they all, was it horsehide? Was it leather?
Initially, they were horsehide. And they came into the inventory in 1931. So they were not new to the Army Air Corps. But because of the Great Depression in the 30s, the quantities, there were actually no records kept for several years on how many were manufactured. Some years they had 500 manufactured, that sort of thing. There's 2 or 3 years they have no record of how many were manufactured. But initially they were horsehide, and then as the war came on, they started running out of horses, to be honest with you. And so they went to cowhide. There were a few made out of goat hide, especially 3,200 or so were made in Australia during the war, and I think those are all goat hide. So good question, thank you. But I show this one because of the color. You know, the color ranged from so dark brown it was almost black, especially on the cuffs, to, you know, like this, sort of a light russet brown, and some had a very red tinge to it as well. And again, I don't know why, to be honest with you, but that's the way it worked out. And you can see here also the lining has been replaced and the no tag up at the top. So this is an interesting story here. This jacket was sent to me from Oakland, California by the son, who's a fine art painter, he and his wife both actually. And he did a lot of research on his dad's time in the service and also afterwards. His dad, after he got back from the war, went to school in Colorado and became an aeronautical engineer and actually worked with Kelly Johnson at the Skunk Works, developing the SR-71, the C-5, the F-117, etc. So his dad was a pretty detail-oriented guy, and this is the only documentation that I've been able to find of what the colors were actually supposed to be on a unit insignia or logo, whatever you want to call it. And as you can see, the cross was supposed to be white, but in the photograph it's sort of a yellowish, and I don't know if that's because it's just faded over time or if they didn't have any white paint. Who knows? But this is what the colors were supposed to be. Nowadays there's called a Pantone matching system, PMS colors, and it tells you what Coke red is supposed to look like, you know, or a certain shade of blue, whatever the case may be, and that's used routinely in the graphic arts world. I don't think they had anything like that in effect at the time, so sometimes you get variations on the colors of these different insignia. Anybody who can tell me that who's in the center of the picture there? This is Eric on the right-hand side. That's General Doolittle on the left, and he's wearing this jacket. I'm like, that's cool. I tried to find General Doolittle's jacket, by the way. I actually swapped emails with his granddaughter. Nobody knows where his jacket is. But this is on the ramp somewhere in England. So I got to photograph at the Smithsonian. This is a Udvar-Hazy complex. It's an annex to the main museum out in Northern Virginia. Gigantic building. They have several very large aircraft in there, but they have a photo studio in the back, basically a large empty room. And I photographed 13 jackets while I was there. This fellow belonged to the 390th Bomb Group. He retired as a brigadier general. You can see the swastikas on there denotes the number of aircraft they shot down. It was a scorecard, essentially. The number of bomb missions. And this is pretty famous artwork. This has been reproduced a number of times. And there's actually a company in Japan, the Toys McCoy Manufacturing Company. You can see on the left, that's the reproduction of the jacket, which you can buy today from what I understand. But if you'll notice, it's got iron crosses down at the bottom instead of swastikas. And I didn't notice that at first, but eventually it dawned on me. It was something in the back of my head kept telling me there was something different. I know in Germany swastikas are illegal to display, and I have a feeling it's the same way in Japan. But they licensed the 2 originals in the lower right there from me to include in this magazine article several years ago. And you'll see the B-17 there, looks like it's dropping something out the belly there. That's actually food, and that's part of Operation Chowhound, which the 390th and several other units participated in. The Brits called it Operation Manna. So what happened in late '44, the Dutch underground apparently did quite a number on the German transportation system, rail essentially, and it ticked them off so much that they instituted a nationwide food embargo in Holland. And by the end of the war, over 18,000 Hollanders had starved to death. A lot of people don't know about this. Audrey Hepburn was a child at the time, which is one of the reasons why she was always so thin. But the King of Holland was exiled in England. and he went to Churchill and Eisenhower and said, hey, can we do something for the people? And they struck a deal with the Germans the last week of the war and said, we won't bomb you if you don't shoot at us, but we want to come over and drop food. And they said, okay. So they did that. I don't know how they managed the communication, but they managed to do it. And as you can see, they dropped almost 4,200 tons of food. If you look up Operation Chowhound, there's a whole Wikipedia page. There's photographs, the Dutch literally holding out their hands as these aircraft flew at low level, dropping food. And it really apparently made quite a difference. The other little symbol you see there is the PW, and that stood for prisoner of war. When the war ended, they immediately marshaled these bombers, and I believe some of them had plywood installed in the bellies of the aircraft so they could carry more people. And they sent them to nearby air bases to these large POW camps and pulled out the guys who needed immediate medical attention. So he also participated in that. So when you start looking at these jackets, they're essentially walking billboards, and you learn how to decipher the symbology and so on. This is one of the goat hide jackets made in Australia. It's in pretty bad shape, actually. It's torn on the sleeve there, and on the back it's got a pretty significant tear. But this was in the collection of the Smithsonian. And these are very rare. And so I had the opportunity, in 2018, went on a road trip with a friend of mine in March, and we went out west to several different museums out there, and at the 390th I photographed 32 jackets, I believe, in one day. It was a long day, but we got it done. And I think of all the jackets in a collection that I saw, they had the most spectacular as far as the artwork goes. Just gorgeous. And that was the one thing that really attracted me when I first started this, was just the artwork and the variety and how it was executed, the design and so on. And for the most part, these were amateur artists. Not all. Some of them, at the time, you have to remember that sign painting was a profession, much more common than it is now, hand sign painting. So guys were drafted, so to speak, to do nose art and to paint on jackets. The parachute denotes a bailout on a mission. A guy's plane went down, so he successfully got out. This is the only jacket of all of them that I photographed that had the bombs on the sleeves, which I thought was pretty cool. And this is another one. This actually has little flag symbols down at the base of the bomb that denotes the country where they were. And you can see the flour bag down at the bottom. That's also another Operation Chowhound veteran. And this jacket here in particular, I don't know why, but you can see down at the bottom, it looks like there might have been 2 bombs here on each side, and it looks like they've been erased. Again, the reason why is lost to time. I have no idea. Maybe they just wanted to change the design. Maybe the artist got overzealous, and they had to correct the number of bombs on there to make sure it matched the records and so on. Who knows? But anyway, this is the tail gunner on the Enola Gay, Staff Sergeant George Caron. The Indiana Military Museum is a tiny museum in Vincennes, Indiana, southern Indiana, and they actually have 2 jackets that are associated with the atomic bomb mission over Hiroshima. And if I recall correctly, this is a size 34 jacket. A 34 then is not a 34 now. And this guy must have been tiny. But I thought it was quite interesting to find that jacket in that little museum. This is a Tuskegee Airman jacket. He never actually saw combat. He graduated, I believe, in May of '45, I believe in the last class. But there's several, if you're a collector, you'll look at this, a knowledgeable collector, and know that there are several condition problems. One is the cuffs and the waistband have been replaced, and they're not the correct woolen material as per the original. You can kind of tell when you look close. And also the liner has been replaced. And if you look underneath the armpits, it's got additional gussets sewn in. The Navy jackets had additional gussets sewn in so you could raise your arm up higher. And they also had the fur collars. The Army jackets didn't have that, and so you could raise your arm somewhat, but it wasn't a very comfortable jacket as far as, range of motion, so to speak. There was let me go back to the front there. There was also, the oversized name tape as well, because there was a standard size name tape that you could get from Supply, and they had a little metal stamp set, and they would put your name on there, etc. So there's several problems with this, but anyway, somebody may want it anyway just because of the rarity of the jacket. You can't tell. But I have come to find out, one of the fellows, and here we go, here's Bob Punchy Powell, friend of ours. I have come to find out one of the chapters I have in the book, I put the word out through Facebook, I don't know, over a year ago. I was looking for somebody to speak about collecting the jackets authoritatively. Several people said I should contact Jeff Schrader. I'm like, okay, well, who's Jeff Schrader? Turns out he's an appraiser for Antiques Roadshow and has been for 10 years. And I sent him an email, sent him some images, told him what I was doing, and he said he would be happy to contribute, and he did. And he wrote a section, 4 or 5 pages on collecting the jackets. But essentially, one of the things he stressed was that if you change the jacket in any way, shape, or form, it devalues its worth to either a collector or a museum. So I had several people say they wanted to change, repair the cuffs or in the waistband before I photographed them. I'm like, no, don't do that. I wanted it just the way it was, and he confirmed that to be the case. Anyway, here's Bob. I photographed he and Henry Huey, Albert McMahon, and several other people in December of 2014, and that sort of got me going on this too. He's wearing a replica jacket here. His original is in the 8th Air Force Museum down at Pooler. This is Vince Masters. I photographed him up in Athens. He was a B-17 pilot, and he completed, I believe, 28 missions because he was also an operations officer for part of that time. So I think some guys got cut a little bit of slack as far as number of missions they had to complete if they had other pressing duties, important duties, whatever the case may be. But instead of coming back to the States in August of '44, he stayed in England and was involved in the creation of a secret unit where the pilots all were former bomber pilots, but they transitioned into P-51s, and they flew ahead of the bomb formations from, October, I believe it was October, somewhere in the fall of '44 till the end of the war. They flew ahead of the bomb formations, assessing weather and defenses at the targets. And it became a very successful effort. And because he was the commander of the unit, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel at 24 years old. I was still second lieutenant at 24, I think. But through no fault of my own. But and afterwards, he flew DC-3s for a time, and then he went back to school and got a medical degree at Stanford and practiced, I think, most of his time in Athens. And he's wearing one of his original shirts from World War II. And the French Legion of Honor. I should say also that there's a pretty detailed story in the book he tells about how they flew a mission where the plane was in bad shape coming back from North Africa. He advised a major who was on his crew, temporarily for that flight, not to drop bombs. And the major said, we're doing it anyway. And the plane essentially went down in the English Channel during a storm, and they floated around in the English Channel for 24 hours before the Brits knew they were there, they just couldn't get to them because there was 30-foot seas. And 4 of the 11 men in the crew drowned, and a couple weeks later he was back on duty as an operations officer. And there's the artwork on his P-51, Master's Mistress. This is Larry Goldstein, and I believe I have a little audio clip here for you.
We arrived at our air base. The base was called Nettishall, that's K with a K, and it was the home of the 388th Bomb Group. We arrived there at night, and we were assigned to a barracks. We walked into the barracks. This was an enlisted men's barracks. There were 6 guys laying on their beds about 8:30 at night, and there were 24 empty beds. And we came in full of swagger. We're airmen. And somebody in our group said, "Where are the guys from the beds?" "Oh, they were all shot down the last few days." What? You could hear our egos crashing to the ground. And in my diary, I wrote, "We unpacked in total silence."
I had the opportunity to photograph Larry and 5 other 8th Air Force veterans up in Asheville in fall of 2015, I believe. And I didn't have a good video camera at the time, but I had an audio recorder. So after I photographed them, I just said, "Tell me a story." And that's what he told me. I had no idea what these guys were going to tell me. And I believe, if I remember correctly, Larry was one of the founding members of the 8th Air Force Museum in Puller. This is Paul Crawford. He's still alive. He lives down in Buckhead. He shot down on his 29th mission in a brand new P-51 in July of '45 in China. And he was picked up by the communist Chinese, and he spent the following 2 weeks plus walking over 200 miles to escape the Japanese. He wound up at the home villa, if you will, of a Chinese businessman who had gone to school in the States. And he had married an American woman, and there was an airfield nearby, and a few days later he was picked up by the OSS, which is now the CIA, and flown out with several other pilots. And he arrived back home to Americus, Georgia on Christmas Eve, 1945. Yes?
Wasn't his brother a B-17 pilot and his other brother a B-24 pilot?
I don't know, Terry.
I'm pretty sure they are. All 3 of them were pilots. One was 17 and 24, and he was
Okay.
because he came to the World War II roundtable and told me
Okay.
himself, because I knew he was still alive.
I see. No, I didn't know that.
In a family before.
Yeah. No, yeah. Right. Thanks. No, I didn't know that. Yeah. And he's wearing a replica jacket here. This is Ray Preston, flew 95 missions as a P-47 pilot. He had already had a stroke when I photographed him, so he couldn't really communicate very well. But we took this model down. It was hanging over his chair in the assisted living facility where he was living. And when I was ready to make the picture, he spontaneously held it up. And to me, it's one of my favorite pictures that I've created. And later, he became the first licensed helicopter pilot in Georgia. And he said because nobody else could fly it, he had his own personal helicopter for a couple of years. And apparently he fell out of a pecan tree in the mid-'50s and bopped his head, and his flying days were over. But nonetheless, a pretty cool story. This is Bob Timberlake, or I should say Richard Timberlake. He combat wounded at B-17. On the way to the target, a piece of flak came up through the bottom of the cockpit and caught him in the back of the femur and broke his leg on the way to the target. They completed the mission. He got back and he spent the last, I believe, 8 months or so in the hospital. And afterwards, he got a doctorate in economics and taught at 3 different universities, eventually retiring at UGA. And he wound up marrying a German woman, too, so go figure. Very nice man, though. Some of you may recognize Dick Cole. He was photographed over in the Epps hangar, and he's in the book in a small way. I tried to find some jackets associated with the Doolittle raid, and actually I did find one at the Air Force Museum. This is General McGee. At the time when I photographed him, he was a colonel, and President Trump elevated him to brigadier general. He's also photographed in the Epps hangar in 2017, I believe. I actually had the opportunity to photograph him twice. Once in the last time in 2021 in the summer at Oshkosh, and I believe he was 102 years old, and he spent the entire week there trooping around the grounds and basically telling kids about aviation and so on. And I asked him, I said, "Sir, you know, why are you doing this?" And he said he thought it was important to get kids involved and to let them know what's possible. Super guy, and he passed away in January of last year, if I recall correctly. And this is a group shot also done over at the Epps hangar in 2017. 6 original Tuskegee Airmen. And I got to tell you, having met these guys, I really enjoyed meeting them, and it was quite evident that they had tons of character. Just, they were very much gentlemen, and I thought they were terrific examples of Americans, to be honest with you. This is Bob Mitchell. He was photographed over in Alabama. He passed away about 45 days after we made this picture. He was a ball turret gunner, and on his last mission, he was assigned to fly a particular crew, and he asked for permission to change planes so he could fly with his buddies. At the last minute, he was already in the plane he was assigned to. Jeep pulled up, says, "Okay, your request has been granted. Come on, I'll take you over to the other plane." And so he swapped crews. And while they were on the mission, the plane that he was originally in collided with another one and went down. And the ball turret fell out of the aircraft. And he saw it all. He completed his last mission and came back and lived to a fine old age. He actually completed a master's degree at Vanderbilt and worked for the Boy Scouts for years. And I believe this is a little video of again, tell me a story.
Before I went into the service, my daddy, being a World War I veteran, said he needed to have a little father-son talk, and he said that I was going into the service, and he said he wanted me to wear that uniform with pride, said it had been worn that way ever since the Revolutionary War, and we had ancestors that fought for the Yankees as well as the Southerners, and so but he said we've always worn that uniform with pride, Dad, and I want you to do the same thing, and said, and it's hard to say, but he said, I want you to come home one of 2 ways, either with the honorable discharge in your pocket, or with a flag draped over your casket. So it's hard to say that, but that's the way we feel about it.
Again, you know, I think back to that time, and you know, I think people were tougher back then, to be honest with you, and had a much more focused sense of purpose, shall we say. Anyway, and again, this was unexpected. This is his jacket here. The actual little bomb, or I should say ball turret logo with the wings on it, he designed that, which I thought was pretty cool. And one thing about it, most times so the technical term for these jackets is A2 summer weight flight jacket. These were not warm jackets. Initially they had a silk lining, and then because silk was needed otherwise, during the war they went to cotton liners, but most often they were not worn on missions because the aircraft were open air, as you know. So, but he told me he wore his on all his missions underneath all the rest of his stuff. But as you can see, he's got his name and squadron and bomb group, etc. inside the jacket. I'm sure that was for ID purposes for him, so it wouldn't walk away in a club or whatever. But that's also instant intelligence for the enemy if he ever got shot down. So technically that was not allowed. But here we have it. And again, you can see the condition of the cuffs and so on. He shot down one ME-109, and because the crew had 4s in their service number or their birthday or their address, something along those lines, they decided to call their plane Little Joe. Apparently that was slang for rolling double deuces in a card game. And then he said, so they had it all painted up and then they never got to fly it. Again, not that uncommon. So these jackets have had and continue to have fashion and cultural impact. I actually hired a fashion historian to do some homework for me on that, and she told me she's found enough information to do her own book on the subject, which wouldn't surprise me. But when she sent her contribution to me, it was 22 typewritten pages, and we had to cut it down a bit for the book. But you know, it's around us today, even though you might not realize it. Here's a jacket that has the fur collar, as you can see, but they started to become much more commonplace in the civilian world, so to speak. Returning servicemen got used to wearing comfortable clothes, and they turned away from wearing suits and so on all the time. And so the manufacturers started making pared-down replicas, and sport jacket peaked in 1951 production, over 2.7 million produced. So there's another ad from the time, and again the lines are unmistakable, especially in the lower left example. So during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy purchased 3 Navy G1 jackets, and they projected strength, etc. And 2 were auctioned in 2020, one for $250,000 and the other one for $192,000. So again, if these jackets have good provenance, so to speak, and provable, they can be worth a lot of money. I saw where one was auctioned, I believe, last week for $13,000, I believe. And from what I understand, the Japanese became big collectors of these jackets in the 80s and 90s. And again, if you could establish good provenance and it had good artwork in good condition, a jacket could be sold for upwards of $20,000. So there's President Kennedy wearing his jackets. President Truman apparently had one, but from what I understand, he never wore it in public. And there's just a still life of President Kennedy's jacket. But most of the other presidents since then have worn one in one form or another. Of course, movies, The Great Escape. I couldn't find a picture of Gregory Peck in 12 O'Clock High, but I'm sure you've all seen that. Now, conservation. I did talk to a professional conservator. There are those people out there too that had done work for the 390th. That's how I was put in touch with her. And a lot of common sense stuff here. Keep them dry, keep them out of the light, control the humidity, no bugs, obviously, an acid-free box and tissue, no hangers. You don't want to leave them on hangers because eventually over time the leather will get pulled down and you'll see the hangers in the corner and that sort of thing. And lastly, no leather treatments. That's probably the most controversial thing she told me, because if you go online, there are just tons of people who advise you to do this and that and the other, and snake oil, etc. And she said that's fine. Leather treatments are fine for things that you use every day, shoes, ball gloves, etc. But it's not good because it wears off. But if you put it on something and then store it, over time it's going to attract dust, and dust attracts other things, and it starts going downhill. So she advised no leather treatments. So questions, please. Yes, sir.
Would you describe how you photograph the jackets? Because
Oh, sure.
I talked about this before, but when you photograph, it looks like it's floating in air.
Right. So essentially what I did, I'm a commercial photographer by trade, and I just thought I'd try this. Actually, I used it on the first jacket, but essentially I made a light box. It's a 4x4 piece of plexiglass that's supported on 2 sides by some plywood, and I painted the inside of the plywood white because I didn't want the dark, the brown tone contaminating the color, and I would put down a piece of white foam core. So we had the foam core, we had the sheets of plywood 1 foot tall on each side, top and bottom, and then I had 2 lights coming in, strobes, and there was a center post also painted white just to hold up the center of the plex, because I got the 1/4 inch thick. I didn't want the flimsy stuff because I didn't want it to be breaking. And then I would lay the jacket down on there, and most of the jackets I put in a little bit of bubble wrap in the center of the jacket so it wouldn't be just totally flat. I didn't put anything in the sleeves because that would be a pain in the butt, and also it might damage the jacket, to be honest with you. So I put a little bit in the torso and just left it at that. Some of the jackets I zipped up the zipper, some not. It just depended. Sometimes we did it both ways. And then I got up on a ladder, and there was a light. So if this is the top of the jacket here and the base of the waistband down there, I had a light here, a beauty dish is what we call it. It's basically a round light modifier about yay big. And and it had a grid on it. So the grid, the light comes out, it's soft because of the beauty dish, but it's directional because of the grid. So I had 2 foam core cards on each side and 1 at the back, so it would bounce into the foam core and then come around. So basically we had the best of both worlds lighting-wise. But I wanted to show the light coming across the top because I wanted to show texture. I could have lit it with just a couple of soft boxes and called it a day, but a soft box doesn't show any texture. So I wanted to show texture, and we achieved that, I think. And then I would get up on a ladder, about a 6-foot tall ladder, and shoot down on it. So, and the other reason why I shot on the white Plex is because I didn't want to spend a lot of time in Photoshop. And I wanted the background to be unobtrusive. There were 3 books done about 20, 25 years ago on jackets, and they're the quote-unquote standard, but they're horribly photographed. They are, you know, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a photographer, but, you know, they would take the jacket in some instances and put it down on the finest plaid tablecloth you could find and shoot it with color film and tungsten light, which gives it a nice orange cast. Other than that, it was okay. And some of them were, you know, put on a mannequin and shot up against the side of a building. It just was no artistic interpretation, shall we say. And, you know, it was a shame. And the other part of it, too, was there was no information about the guy other than, you know, here's Tommy Jones and XYZ bomb group. That doesn't tell me anything. Where was Tommy Jones from? What did he do? You know, what was his mission? You know, what did he do after the war? Did he survive? Was he a POW? Whatever, you know. So I tried to, once I got into it and started hearing the stories, it became apparent to me that the jackets were an appropriate way to tell the stories of these guys and their heroism, essentially. You know, to a man, they would say I was not a hero, but to my mind, what they did was pretty heroic. You know, to be able to climb, have the gumption to climb into a bomber or a fighter, for that matter, day after day after day, knowing that you're going to get shot at, and yet willing to go do it anyway, just spoke volumes to me. I'm not sure I could have done it, to be honest with you. You know, and the other thing I should mention too, someone asked me earlier, when was the first jacket painted? I have no idea. But I do know that essentially it was against regulations to paint on the jackets, but because the casualty rates were so high early in the war, they let the guys do it anyway. And you got to remember, these were young guys. I mean, 17, in some instances, 18, 19. When Jimmy Stewart went into the service, he was 33 years old, and he was considered old, you know. It was not uncommon for him to be, you know, 10 years older than the other guys around him, easily. But because these guys were so young, they allowed them to do it because they could be gone tomorrow, literally and figuratively, and it was a morale booster. You know, it really, in a lot of instances, helped solidify the crew identity, so to speak. And so as long as it wasn't obscene, it was pretty well tolerated. Yes, sir.
I think I remember, I heard you say that they were historically warm weather jackets.
Correct.
And then that they didn't really wear them when they went on missions most of the time.
Correct.
So would, say, a B-17 crew, they got up there and it was super cold. You always hear these stories about being so cold.
Right.
They didn't necessarily wear these for warmth. They had other flight gear to keep them warm.
Correct.
Is that
Oh, yeah. Electrically heated flight suits were created at one point in the war. I can't remember, maybe 43, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. But of course, if the electrics got shot out on the plane, you know, no more electric blanket, so to speak. But they had. So you got to remember, and there's a picture in the book early on that I found from a magazine, I believe, at the time, but it shows all the gear that these guys were wearing. They wore these big, thick boots, you know, and these thick overalls, you know, and thick gloves. And, you know, and they would have a headset on and an oxygen mask. Sometimes they would have a steel pot on. Sometimes they would have a steel flak vest, if you will. You know, so they could be wearing 40 pounds of gear, you know, before they got in the plane. And then they're hooked up to the electrical supply the oxygen mask, the headset, etc., and they've got 50 caliber ammunition down around their feet if they're a waist gunner, you know, and the plane all of a sudden takes a hit, you know, and goes down violently. There's no doubt in my mind that's why these guys couldn't get out. They look big on the outside, but they are not big on the inside. And, you know, centrifugal force and everything else, or they might have been wounded, you know. So a lot of times when these aircraft were hit, they went down, all 10 men. Yes, sir.
Yeah, John, just a comment and a question. Your point about style of these jackets, being in style in Japan. Yeah, I was in Japan in the 80s, and I remember the flight jackets were very in style in Japan, and particularly the type of jackets that they would wear on missions with the wool lining. And those were very much in fashion in Japan in the 80s. But anyway, my question is about the paint. I imagine there was different types of paint used. That have you found that generally it was oil-based paint? Because I'm thinking latex-based for a while.
Yeah, apparently acrylics didn't come into existence till the mid-50s. So yeah, I think these were all either oil-based paints or aircraft paint in some instances, because that's all they could get their hands on. Yeah, absolutely. Other questions, please. Yes, sir, Terry.
John, two things. The diplomat one, the diplomat jacket had the missing bombs. I realize that B-17 is the exact same painting that's on my dad's jacket. So it must have been the same artist. Do you remember,
it could be.
Do you remember what bomber group the diplomat jacket?
That's the 390th. 390th, I believe, yeah.
Okay. I'm just curious. I'll have to go back and do a little research on that. It's the exact same painting of the B-17. I'm sure it wasn't a mold, or at least I wouldn't think it would be. Other question was, yeah, that B-17 is exactly the same that's on my dad's jacket. And my dad's jacket on the tail has a C, square C. I can't see what that one is.
I can't see it either. I think it might be a J. I can't remember.
I've never seen another one like that, so it's cool to see that. Another question. Other countries in Europe, say, did any of them paint their jackets at all, or Japan?
Not to my knowledge. I think this was entirely an American thing, which doesn't surprise me, to be honest with you. You know, but you know, I do know there are several photographs in existence of German fighter pilots wearing captured jackets. Because they thought it was cool, you know. It's like, hey, I got an A2 and you don't, you know. And yeah, absolutely. And the Germans had their own style of leather jackets. The Germans generally are into leather anyway, you know. But they, I don't know. It was a more of a European style. You know, they had angled zippers and things like that. You know, but as far as I know, nobody else painted up the jackets like the Americans did.
The other thing, I can't imagine wearing one of these down the streets of London. The women must have thought you were a star.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, and I'm sure the guys loved it too. You know, because you know, they looked great. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and I've tried to imagine walking into a briefing room where all, you know, 50, 100 of these guys were wearing these jackets. It must have knocked your eye out, you know. I mean, it must have been spectacular, but of course we don't have any color pictures from that day, you know. You know, so I you know, again, I try and imagine that. Yes, sir.
I was curious, that one jacket where the guy put the countries on the bottom. Can you go back to that? Just tell us what he marked.
Yeah, yeah, this one here. Yeah, so if I recall, so you can see the swastikas down at the bottom here. I don't know if I can make it any bigger or not. I don't think I can make it any bigger. I could the original. In the original, you can see it for sure. Yeah, so there's France, of course, Germany, I believe Poland. There's several countries. I can't remember exactly. Yeah, but again, and some of them, like you saw in the little video at the beginning, sometimes they would actually paint the name of the target on their Berlin or what have you, you know. And several of these guys were D-Day veterans too. So, you know, but I tried to include jackets from all theaters. You know, I've got a jacket from the Pacific where a guy was awarded the Medal of Honor. Actually, there were two men on the same crew awarded the Medal of Honor for the same flight. They undertook a very hazardous mission where in a lone B-17 that was heavily armed with machine guns, it had been highly modified, shall we say, they took on upwards of 20 Japanese fighters and shot down half a dozen or so. The pilot was severely wounded, but he got back to a air base in New Zealand. I think it was Australian. And they thought he was dead when they landed. And, you know, they were going to leave him until they got the rest of the crew out, and they pulled him out, and he survived. He was medically retired from the Air Force in '45 as a lieutenant colonel, but you know, just an unbelievable mission. And it was a photo reconnaissance mission for a potential beach landing. You know, so there's, and as it turns out, the rest of the crew was awarded, I'm trying to remember, what's the medal just below the Medal of Honor, Brent, do you? Distinguished Flying Cross? The Service Cross, correct, yes, thank you. Yeah, all the rest of the crew was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. So they were most heavily awarded crew in the war, aircraft crew. You know, just the amount of guts these guys exhibited on, you know, on occasion just is astounding. And fortitude and devotion to each other, and also devotion to accomplishing the mission. It went way beyond just getting the job done, so to speak. Other questions, please? Well, I really do appreciate your attention and your patronage. This was all self-financed, and so I'm trying to earn the money back so I can make Marietta happy, you know, and you know, and it just really meant a lot to me personally. So thank you very much.